Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay? I do tend to speak quietly normally, so shout up, I'm sure you will. I've been here before as a member of the audience, so I know you to be a shy, retiring group, especially 2 weeks ago. Okay, phones it's already been mentioned. As John said, I'm British, so what I want to do is to share an international, a European perspective of an area of the world that is very important to us, and yet also deeply complex. John said a little bit about my background. I have degrees in biology, computer science, and business administration, and have tended to specialize in what are known as complex systems, and that's pretty well anything that involves human beings. So today we are looking at what I consider to be a very complex area, and therefore, please keep your questions until the end, because what I want us to do is to sort of take a journey through time, build up a history, and look at the influences on the Kurds and Kurdistan today. And that's quite a complex picture. So it's quite likely that you'll have questions that will actually be answered as that picture comes together. So here's the order of play, if you like. We're going to zoom through about 3,000 years of history fairly quickly, and then look at the picture of the Kurds from a Kurdish perspective. So that means looking at Kurds in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, and Iran. Okay, and as that picture emerges, then look at, well, where do we think that's going, and what does it mean for us? So these are the topic questions. Those of you who have got the book will recognize these. These are the main points made in the booklet, and I thought they're quite a nice focus as we're going through. So I'll put this slide back up at the end, and we can perhaps think about them in the context of the talk. We're going to look at history. History, we tend to think of history as being nice and established and set. In fact, I've put up a few slightly amusing examples here where history is not the way we think it is. It has changed. There are two of my favourites. One of them is that the Statue of Liberty was originally intended to be a Muslim woman stood in the Suez Canal welcoming the hordes from Asia into Europe, which is a rather odd thought, isn't it? But my real favourite is the St. George. Okay, so St. George is the patron saint of England, and inside England there is a fairly extreme right-wing neo-Nazi political party called the British National Party. And these guys, they're skinheads really, with tattoos and knuckles dragging on the floor as they walk around. They fly the flag of St. George, and they really don't like any kind of foreign people, no matter the colour of the skin or where they come from. They object to foreigners. So there's a delicious irony, in my view, that St. George was a Palestinian mercenary. Who's going to tell them? I don't think I can. Nation states. John made the point that Kurdistan is not actually a nation state. These are a relatively modern invention. Okay, Germany wasn't a country until 1861. Italy about the same time. India wasn't really a country until the British left in 47. Excuse me. So just to place ourselves, Iraq, and look at the interested parties, very, very close. I mean, this is a small area by Texas standards. Yeah. So the Kurds identify themselves as Medes. And this is a picture of the Median, or the Mede Empire from 2.5, nearly 3,000 years ago. What I find particularly interesting here is, see the Caucasian the Caucasus, and this whole area where the Medes come from. That's where most of the people here come from. We're Caucasians. Right? Those are our roots. The difference between us and the Kurds is that they've stayed there. We've all moved. Right? We tend to forget that if you look at the history of the earth, it's people moving around on the surface of the earth. Then they get somewhere and they say, okay, we're here, you can't come in. We keep doing it time and again. The Kurds haven't, and that's an important quality. So let's go forward about 100 years, and a very famous chap called Cyrus came along, Cyrus the Great of Persia, and although the Persian Empire absorbed the Medes, the Kurds, they were pari passu. They're on the same level as the Persians. They were not subjugated. Okay. So let's go forward, 1,100 years. Guess what? We've still got a Persian Empire there. And operator error. If we look here at India, you'll see a good example of India as it was, and as it was for a long time, which was many little kingdoms. Okay? Got the Byzantine Empire up here, which we'll come back to. Let's go forward a little further. This is Saladin's empire. I've all heard of Saladin. You may think of him as a rogue or whatever. In fact, he was quite a chivalrous character and very generous. And also, a historical perspective is that when he captured Jerusalem, he let the Crusaders go for free. And the resident Christians were allowed to stay. And you contrast that with when the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, and they slaughtered between 10 and 70,000 people, Muslims and Jews. They burnt the Jews in a synagogue. So, people, we have assumptions about history which don't always check out. And Saladin was a Kurd. So another aspect of this is, look, this is the Kurdish Empire. So we've come forward, 1,000, 1,500, 1,600 years, and the Kurds are still there. The next major event, okay, so there were some, the Mongols came in, and there were various other empires. But of great significance was the formation of the Ottoman Empire. I need a little practice. This area here, Istanbul, of course, was Constantinople, and it was the Ottoman Empire, its emergence, that finished off the old Holy Roman Empire, the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman Empire, of course, stretched for 600 years. And since that's where the majority of the Kurds are now, it's worth just thinking about the influence. For most of the time of the duration of the Ottoman Empire, they treated the Kurds really well. And they did that for a reason. They very wisely went to see the various princes and so forth in the Kurdish area, and they cut a deal with them. They said, if you will act as a bulwark against Persia, you can have autonomy. So within the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, the Kurds were used to having a Kurdistan, their own autonomy within that empire. They got protection of the Ottoman Empire, they got autonomy. And if you think of Persia as being just over here, they were a bulwark. Okay? And one of the themes that comes through looking at this history is this sense of the Kurds being in between other great powers. Yeah? As we get into the 1800s, that autonomy of the Kurds is reduced. They more and more find that the new generation of Turks coming through don't want them to have autonomy. They resent the fact that they are separate, that they have a different language, different culture, and so forth. So by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, the Kurds are fighting against the repressions that they're experiencing from the Ottoman Empire. Okay? So the Ottoman Empire takes us up to the First World War, where the Ottoman Empire made a mistake, it joined the wrong side. Okay? So the Kurds, of course, who were fighting against the Ottomans, were on the right side. So when we come to the end of the First World War, a treaty of Sèvres was written up, which gave to the Kurds their own country, Kurdistan. Can you imagine what that must have felt like to them when they? Yeah, one of the things I want us to try and do is get a sense of, let's be Kurds, let this be a Kurdish community for a moment in spirit. And can you imagine what that felt like? You've, for hundreds of thousands, a long time, you've been seeking your own autonomy, and suddenly you got it. Fabulous. But guess what? There were behind-the-scenes maneuverings. So there were a couple of famous gentlemen called Sykes-Picot. Mark Sykes was an Englishman, and I think it was Didier Picot was a Frenchman, and they were two bureaucrats, essentially. And they came up with a plan, they drew up a plan, which carved up this area into British and French domains. Okay? So you can see coming out of that was Syria, Iraq, and so forth. Yeah? When we think that history is a long time ago, it's worth remembering when ISIS last year came charging out of Iraq, really, and radius spreading through. One of the things they did was create a video of themselves destroying the border posts, and in the video they made reference to the Sykes-Picot line. Okay? Think about it. So the guys living there, what is this border? We're semi-nomadic people. We wander around with our sheep and our goats and camels or whatever. Yeah? And suddenly some bureaucrats, 2,000 miles away, have told us that this is not our country, that is our country, whatever. Yeah, that has echoed through, so that even today, the people on the ground, and ISIS were making a point about this, about breaking down nation states put upon them by other people. Very interesting how these echoes come forward. So what we have is France and Britain basically owning this territory. And so you'll see in the next couple of slides that created problems. Okay? The Kurds, what are they going to do? They were fighting the Ottomans, they're going to fight the British or whoever else is there. Remember, these guys haven't moved. This is their identity. This is where they live. Yeah? So this fellow, very famous within Kurdish circles, Mahmud Barzanji, declared a Kurdish kingdom in Iraq, as it happened, because the British, as they would, squashed him. Dear old Churchill, who in some sense sometimes seen as a hero, sometimes as a complete rogue, He had some very questionable personal values, although he rallied Britain brilliantly to fight the Nazis. So not uncommon with great people to see these contradictions. He used mustard gas. So chemical weapons were used by the British on the Kurds just after a war where the British army had suffered awfully, as had others, from chemical weapons. Yeah. Things we do, eh? So, however, what happened with Barzanji, he and lots of other guys, of course, were fighting against the British. As they got defeated, then one of the younger fellows that was growing up and fighting with him was another fellow called Barzani. It is a different guy. The names are very similar, but it's a different guy. Barzani. And this fella took a few thousand of his soldiers across from Iraq into Iran. And whilst in Iran, guess what? They declared another Kurdistan. Yeah, there's a bit of a theme here, isn't there? Now, okay, so Barzani fought in Iraq, went to Iran. He ended up in Iran being attacked by the Iranians. He then went and took exile in Azerbaijan. A little while later, there's a coup in Iraq, so he comes back and he has a fairly good position in Iraq. Okay? While he's in Iraq, another young man comes forward, who we'll see later, called Talabani. Talabani, whilst in Damascus, creates a new political party for Iraq. Okay, so I'll just go through that again. Okay, so Barzani goes from Iraq to Iran, to Azerbaijan, back to Iraq. Talabani goes to Damascus, Syria, and back. What are these guys doing? Are they, as I've just described, moving between different countries? Or are they going around their own greater Kurdistan? Can you see? They don't see themselves, in my view, as moving between countries. It's all one to them. This guy's son, by the way, is the present president of Iraq. Okay, so when Barzani got back to Iraq, once again the Kurds, they're resisting and fighting, this time against Saddam. Well, they get to the point where Saddam gets fed up with us and cuts a deal with them, and they have an autonomous region. That autonomous region doesn't last for too long, because what Saddam does is try to Arabize Kurdistan. In other words, move other people, Arabs, into Kurdistan as a way of diluting the population, reducing this desire for independence. And if you want to know what the Kurds thought about that, I found this quote online. I think it's a lovely quote. They said, "The mountains are not deserts, and I'm not an Arab." That was their response to being Arabized. Yeah. They have a saying that their only friends are the mountains. It's kind of understandable, isn't it, if you look at this history. Okay, so more conflict. Along comes the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, and of course the Kurds worked to help the US and so forth. But coming out of that was the no-fly zones that you probably remember. One in the south for the Shia and one in the north for the Kurds. Unfortunately, the one in the north did not include a couple of important places for the Kurds, so Saddam was still attacking them, so there was still that kind of conflict and stress for the Kurdish people. but it did give them an opportunity to build, which they did start doing. So they worked on economical development, and also the PUK that had been created by Talabani and the KDP, which Barzani had created, established themselves as two dominant political parties, which for the Kurds meant they had a political structure that the West would recognize rather than just a tribal structure. So these two guys are the ones that created these parties. Very different characters, Talabani and Barzani. And here you can see within Iraq the breakdown of, if you like, power for those two groupings. And that's not unrelated to their backing of Turkey and Iran, PUK. They ended up fighting each other. So we had a power struggle. That power struggle was a pretty bad time for the Kurds, where brother was fighting brother and so forth. You know what happens in civil wars. And a low point for Barzani was when it looked like the PUK, with the help of Iran, were going to overrun the KDP. So he actually went and asked for help from Saddam. And you can imagine how that rankled with an awful lot of people. And then in 1997 we had a ceasefire. Let's briefly look at Iran. Iran isn't really addressed in the booklet, but there are 4 million Kurds there, so you can't really forget about it. There is an institute in Paris which is devoted to the formation of Greater Kurdistan, and that means all 4 countries. That's Kurdish areas within Iran, Iraq, Turkey and Syria. As usual, the Kurds find themselves on the rough end of the deal. They, for a while, it looks like they're going to have some kind of autonomy, but then gradually they find, in this case through the religious dictums of Ayatollah Khomeini, find them being discriminated against and put down. Mostly the Sunni. Most of the Kurds in Iran are Sunni, whereas Iran, of course, is predominantly Shiite. So you had classical religious conflict as well, which continues to this day. Not major conflict such as we're seeing in Iraq and Syria, but conflict nonetheless. Here we are. Thanks to the CIA, we have a nice map of the Kurdish areas in this century. Okay, so we've come a few thousand years. We've ended up finally in the 21st century. Kurdish peoples, total numbers vary, but around 33, 35 million people. And that's a lot of people who strongly identify with their own area who do not have a country. Think about that. That's bigger than some European countries. Yeah. As we come into this century, then these two dominant parties in Iraq unite. They first of all unite against Saddam, and then of course as the Second Gulf War comes in and Iraq is invaded, then they work very bravely, very courageously in support of our troops going in there. So they, apart from anything else, that's good political placement. Yeah, they then came out of that period with elections in Iraq, where between them, Barzani and Talabani, working together, did very well in the national elections of Iraq, such that an autonomous Kurdistan region was created within Iraq, And of these two, this is Talabani, who became president of all of Iraq, and Barzani, who is the president of the Kurdish region. So these two guys who've been struggling for quite a long while end up in powerful positions. But don't forget, this political stuff is on top of very, very old tribal thinking. And so you have those two men are two parties, are two families, essentially. And as often happens, when you destroy a state, or when a great trauma affects a country, one of the things coming out of that tends to be gangs, right? So after the Soviet Union collapsed, what emerged in Russia were gangs. Those gangs fought it out, and eventually the toughest guys got to the top. Yeah, that's how the kings and queens in England got there, by the way. So this is not an uncommon phenomenon where dominant guys end up also becoming associated with corruption. So these two parties are seen by the young people as being corrupt, and a new party emerged in 2009. So that's changing the scene. But it does mean you've got a somewhat chaotic aspect, so that at the moment the politics within the Kurdish area of Iraq are in turmoil. Okay? Let's look at Turkey. So this is Turkey, just to orient you. Dardanelles up there. This area is predominantly Kurdish. 16 million Kurds in Turkey. Okay, 20% of the population. That's sizable. That is big. Different language and identity and so forth. Continuing on after the First World War was conflict between the Kurds and Turkey, such that even the surrounding countries all tried to do a deal to stop the Kurds moving from one country to the other. Finally, in '78, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, was created by this fella. He looks very happy here. He doesn't look so happy in the next slide. And they fought. They fought for independence. This is, I was sitting on a plane flying out of Chicago when I first saw this photograph in a newspaper, 1999. And I remember thinking, that guy's in for a very difficult time. So at the end of the last century, the capture of Öcalan took the wind out of the sails, if you like, of the PKK. And so they effectively declared a ceasefire. Öcalan was sentenced to death, but he did not die. What they did was they took him, they were going to kill him, the Turks were, but there was an international outcry, particularly from Europe, against it. And Turkey at that time was agitating strongly with US help to try and get into the European Union. So they held back for whatever, and I think for more than just that reason, but they held back. And so Öcalan was deemed to be so dangerous, they put him on an island. They had an island with nobody else on it. They put a prison there. They put Öcalan in the middle of it, and they put 1,000 troops around him. Right? That's like Count of Monte Cristo, isn't it? It's that kind of stuff. But what's fascinating is that he's still the head of the PKK, and his views moved from Marxism to democracy. So he advocates now a democratic confederation for the Kurdish people, which is quite a shift. And his words and thinking are now spread throughout the Kurds, certainly in Turkey and in Syria. We'll see that in a moment. He was inspired by an American, a chap called Murray Bookchin. Anybody ever heard of him? A well-known anarchist in New York, I think. This is just really important. Okay, so growing up in Britain as the British Empire gently sailed off into the seas, one of the things I was constantly aware of is that today's terrorist is tomorrow's statesman. Yeah, time and time and time again. We won't speak to those guys. We will not talk to them. Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit. Okay, hi, how do you do? Yeah, time and time again we do it. Yeah, so some of our leaders, that was their background. Yeah, so it's a very common phenomenon. Okay, so we looked briefly at the Kurds in Iran and in Turkey. How am I doing for time? In essentially what happened in Syria, the Kurds, as usual, were repressed. People keep wanting them to stop speaking their own language and having their own culture. It must be a real drag. So they fought against it. But then as the Arab Spring emerged and Assad became somewhat distracted in Syria, he effectively moved troops away from the Kurdish area, leaving something of a vacuum. In other places, ISIS came in. So there was this sort of sense of chaos, and the Kurds grabbed their opportunity. They formed the YPG and YPJ. YPJ are the ladies and women. And they have been amongst the most effective units fighting against ISIS. Okay. And they formed their own governing council. And what they did was rather interesting. This is northern Syria, okay? And what the Kurds have done there is to create 3 cantons, 3 self-governing areas, and they have declared this whole area to be, they call it Rojava. And this has its own constitution, which you look at that's not a bad constitution, is it? Guarantee political, cultural freedoms, women's rights, ethnic minority rights, and so forth, right? Most of us could live with that, I think. But what is particularly relevant at the moment, this little area just here, a town called Azaz and Aleppo, there's a lot of fighting going on there at the moment. That is the principal ISIS resupply route from Turkey. Okay? Turkey has said that this place here, Jarabulus, is the Euphrates comes down here. Okay? Turkey said that's a red line. If the Kurds cross that and own that, we will attack. Okay, so just a quick summary of so the Kurds are fighting ISIS, Turkey's fighting the Kurds. That town I just mentioned, Jarabulus, just this last month, Turkish troops crossed into Jarabulus, which was notionally an ISIS stronghold. And clearly what they're doing there is they're very concerned about the Kurds consolidating their position in northern Syria because of the Kurdish population in Turkey. The last thing they want is an example of an autonomous, successful Kurdish state. So it's very, very difficult. And of course, Turkey's our ally. Okay, so we've looked at different levels here. This is like a layer cake. Okay, so we've looked at the people involved, we've looked at the political parties they formed, and somewhat about the local nations. If we step up and look at the commercial level, then don't know how many of you are aware that there is a major dispute about gas pipelines. There was a proposal for a pipeline to come through from Qatar, to go through Syria, and there's a proposal for one to come through from Iran. Assad said no to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and yes to Iran. Some conspiracy-minded people think that this might be what a lot of the fighting is about. I couldn't possibly say that, but some people do. So, I've been trying to, as we've gone, I've tried to take a Kurdish perspective, or at least try to get a sense of people who are there and are not going anywhere, right? When you think about these guys, people like the Barzani and Barzanji, they've gone through, we fight for democracy. What do? We go and fill in a form. Yeah? These guys have fought. They've been tortured, they've been exiled, they've fought. Right? So we must not underestimate their determination. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is put up some reports that are common around the world, but I haven't seen very much report in the US. Okay, so some of this information may be new to you, some of it may be old hat. All the things I put up have multiple sources, so I'm confident about them. And remember that that lovely phrase about the facts speak for themselves is wrong. Facts don't say anything. People say things in context. Yeah? Anybody who's got teenage children knows that. Yeah. So the reason, or one of the reasons for me putting these up, is to think, how does that look to the Kurdish people? Yeah? Because our question is about the future of the Kurds. And do we determine that? No, but we can determine how we relate to them, and that means understanding them and their world. Multiple agents, multiple agenda. Whenever you see a country surrounded by big guys, you know that there's all kind of stuff, all kind of things going on underneath the surface. You can guarantee that the CIA, MI6, Mossad, FSB from Russia, all these guys are in there with their own agenda. Yeah. Just to remind us, here we are in this little area here we're talking about. Mr. Brzezinski wrote a book. Anybody seen it? The Grand Chessboard. Well done.
I haven't read his book, but he spoke at UTT many years ago.
Okay, thank you. The gist of it is to look at the world as a chessboard, and you just move pieces around. Okay? That's the antithesis of what I've been trying to do here, which is to say, what are the people like? What's going on? Yeah. But that is a way of thinking. Okay, so earlier last year, early summertime, 50 intelligence analysts within the Pentagon blew the whistle on something. Now, when one guy blows a whistle, has he just got an axe to grind? Is he unhappy? Is he fed up? If 2 or 3 guys, you start to pay attention. If it's like 10 guys, 50, okay? 50 analysts who were writing reports, generating information about what was happening with respect to ISIS, complained that senior officers in the Pentagon were downplaying what they were saying. Okay, they were upset that their reports were not the information wasn't being put out there. It was exactly the opposite. It wasn't that they were being ignored. So where they might be saying that ISIS is making great gains here, the report said there is no movement. Okay, so really significant. This was So it wasn't just one or two. You think what it takes for 50 guys to stand up and complain. The Inspector General found there was credibility to their claims, and the House started an inquiry into it in December. So it's real, right? So, suddenly ISIS are doing all over the place. Well, there was a period before that when we knew what they were doing, but we were not reporting it. Okay, so 100 million, a lot of dollars were spent on training a bunch of guys in Jordan to go in and be the opposition fighting against Assad. What happened? They went from Jordan, got into Syria, gave all their weapons to ISIS, al-Nusra and ISIS, and joined them. General Austin said, we have 4 or 5 guys that we've trained. Okay, this is after quite a big program. Okay? Not 4 or 5 divisions, not 4 or 500, 4 or 5. It's 2 years after ISIS burst on the scene. It's generally accepted that ISIS is funded by Saudi Arabia, not only Saudi Arabia, but by Saudi Arabia and by Qatar. Okay, the Gulf states are shoveling money to ISIS, and yet they're our allies. Saudi Arabia, of course, the predominant form of Islam is Wahhabi, which is the same very extreme version that ISIS maintain. This chap. Okay, so one had the impression in 2014 that ISIS came out of nowhere. In fact, there was a Department of Defense Intelligence Agency report anticipating it 2 years previously, which said that at that point they were looking at Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, saying they are going to go in this direction towards Syria. They are going to declare a caliphate. And that is what the Western powers want. Okay, I've read the report, that's what it says. It's available online, it's declassified. This chap, I saw this fellow who was he was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time, and he admitted that, yes, he looked at this report, pushed it up to the administration, and nothing was done about it. And he indeed went on to agree that the administration was willfully supplying weapons to Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and so forth in their fight against Assad. So, effectiveness, the really effective people fighting against ISIS were who? The Kurds, different kinds of Kurds in Syria, the Kurds in Iraq, and the Iranian-led Shia militia in Iraq. That's uncomfortable, isn't it? Here's I think this quote is actually in the booklet. The Peshmerga, so the guys fighting ISIS, were stunned at the quality of weapons that we'd given to the Iraqi army, who, when ISIS turned up, threw up their hands and ran away. They got all the good stuff, and we who are fighting for our villages, our women, our children, our lives, got nothing. So what did they do? They went to Iran. And then we don't give them weapons because they got some from Iran. Turkey. There is an awful lot of evidence out there that Turkey has been facilitating ISIS. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. They don't want the Kurds to gain autonomy. And one way to stop that is to see essentially Assad removed from power in a chaotic manner. Yeah. So ISIS fighters talk about Turkey as helping them. There are leaked documents from the Turkish military showing them funding Al-Qaeda. Most of the smuggling of oil coming out of the Kurdish area has been done by Turkey. In fact, Erdogan's son seems to be the principal character. And there's a rather superb example of the complexities when you think about it. The Kurds are helping ISIS smuggle their oil out to Turkey, who's bombing them, and sending it to Israel, who's supposed to be an enemy. Wow. All working together. They're extraordinary. So, the reason that was given that we didn't attack the oil convoys, which were funding and providing money for ISIS, is that it would create environmental damage. I just don't believe that. I find that really hard to. I saw the guy, Morale, saying this. He was questioned by Charlie Rose, and it was just Charlie didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. So remember, we're trying to look at this from a Kurdish perspective. What does all that feel like? Yeah? Whether it's true or not, and I'm pretty confident about these sources. There are lots of reports about it from established investigative journalists out there who live out there and so forth. What does that feel like for the Kurds? Are we of one mind? Is it possible that the things that were happening in the Pentagon or elsewhere reflect conflicting strategies within our departments, within the Pentagon, the CIA, the White House, so forth? We were asked if we have a vision of a unified Iraq. Do we have a unified vision of Iraq? Yeah? Do we look at it with one mind? So we're in all of this tangled web. What on earth do we do? Where are we? Where are our interests? We seem to be in a position where if we want to fight ISIS, we have to fight alongside people that we really don't like. Yeah? Whether it's Iran or Russia, whatever. I've looking at reports the other day of coordinated airstrikes by Russia and the US against ISIS positions. Okay, now that's not publicized too much, but because Russia's the enemy, yeah. But actually, in that case, we have shared interests. So it's complex. You see what I mean about complexity? A very good article in Foreign Affairs talks about Washington's Middle East pullback. And what that is saying is, if you look at what's happened as we've intervened in places like Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, are we prepared to do that one more time in Syria? Yeah. We've got 3,000 odd troops on the ground in Iraq at the moment. Yeah. Do we really want that? Ash Carter, the Defence Secretary, has just announced the defence budget for 2016, which is $600 billion. Bigger than the next 10 countries combined. Don't know if you realise that. Yeah, our defence budget is bigger than the combined budgets of Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, England, France, Italy. Right, the next 10 down the list. And we've budgeted $7.5 billion to fight ISIS starting next October. It's a lot of money. Maybe in terms of thinking of Brzezinski, if we think about geopolitics, Russia, Chinese alliance, massive movements in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the emergence of the petro yuan. as we see a potential demise of the petrodollar. Yeah. What do we do? What's happening at the moment in the peace talks in Geneva right now is that the Kurds aren't invited. Of course, ISIS and al-Nusra are not invited. So essentially it's going to be up to Russia and the US to determine the outcome. Where are the Kurds in that? Are we not back 100 years ago? Yeah. So one of this is a great quote. I believe it's an American quote. It's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Right? And there's a lot of fight in these Kurdish people. An awful lot. Yeah. So, these are the points. Thanks for letting me do this, because I have something's come out of this for me, which is that I hadn't appreciated before, which was the sense of the identity of the Kurdish people. They don't see themselves as Iraqi Kurds or Syrian Kurds or Iranian Kurds or Turkish Kurds. They see themselves as Kurds. And if a key to successful decision making is that whoever's going to implement the decision needs to be involved in making that decision. Okay, that's usually when things don't go wrong, is when you want somebody to implement a decision that they don't agree with. Yeah? So what do we do? We're here, this is great decisions time, right? We are a microcosm of our nation. What do we do? Questions?
As Americans, we talk about the melting pot of America and how that makes us stronger. But when we look at other parts of the world, we see more of a balkanization, where everybody wants to have their own country and their own enclaves and live separately. Are we, which side of history are we on with our way of thinking? Is it going to be something that prevails, or is Europe and everybody else going to go backwards?
That's a superb question. The French Revolution. What happened in the French Revolution? In the middle of it, people were sitting down and saying to each other, what is it to be a citizen? What does that mean? Right? They'd been serfs or whatever up until then. As I was putting this together, I was thinking, what is it to be a nation state? What does that mean? If we look at it, we've got 4 nation states, each kicking the whatever out of their people, right? Not accepting their people as themselves, wanting to get rid of their language and so forth. If I take an analogy which is team building, okay, when I've had good teams working with me, they have been composed of quite different characters. Quite different, because it works better that way. So I'm kind of inclined personally towards the multicultural approach rather than everybody should be the same. Yeah.
Do you agree, though, on what you just said, that there was a common language for the project, that you had your multidisciplinary group? In other words, it was a mechanism for you that was common among the people that you had in your group to be able to converse?
Well, there were commonalities. The principal commonality actually was technology, not language.
No, that was in language.
No, that's right. There were commonalities, but actually the team I'm thinking of, there were Danish, French, English.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
That what bonded you together in the group was a language that you could have discussion.
Well, actually,
and a project.
Yeah, that's right. I would say the real bonding was the purpose. Yeah, and that was facilitated by the language. So, for instance, whether that's technology or whatever.
Transfer to this situation.
Well, the Kurds clearly have a purpose, don't they? I mean, they've been. Their purpose is to build an independent Kurdish state of some kind.
But the analogy that we were using was commonality was your case.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, is there within the region a way to transfer that into that environment?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. It requires many of the things I've said today would be vociferously disagreed with by a bunch of the people involved here. How do you move that? Yeah.
First, when you came to America, you came to America. You didn't stay in Kurdistan. So you probably better adapt to America because you chose to come here.
Yeah.
Second,
Yeah.
don't I recall that the Turks blocked us going into Iraq through Turkey supply routes? They haven't been very friendly.
To whom?
When we were either Gulf War I or Gulf War II,
Yeah.
we couldn't even overfly their territory.
Yeah, that was because we wouldn't let them invade Iraq. They, because of the value of the Kurds, Turkey wanted to come in and hunt down the PKK and any other offending Kurds. There's no doubt about that, and we wouldn't let them. So there were problems then, quite right. This time round, we cut a deal with Turkey to use the Incirlik air base so that we could bomb ISIS, and effectively we turned a blind eye on them attacking the Kurds. They were supposed to be part of the coalition against ISIS included Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Saudi Arabia promptly went and bombed Yemen, and Turkey bombs the Kurds. But it all counts. Yes.
What kind of influence, if Turkey joined the European Union, what kind of influence does the European Union have on Turkey in trying to resolve the Kurdish issue? Or are they just in the same position we are?
Yeah.
Everybody's just throwing up their hands going, I don't know.
This massive pushback from Europe has been the case. There was a period in the 90s when particularly for some reason the US was very keen that Turkey should get involved with Europe, and most Europeans pushed back on that and said no, it's too different. The cultural mix is like a real challenge.
So now the European Union, they mostly wish that Turkey had not joined, and they don't want that.
Yeah.
Is that going to cause the whole thing to disappear? The European Union?
Wow, that's another talk.
That seems to be fracturing.
Shall we do that next time?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, gentleman at the back there.
Yes, my name is Mr. Moore. My name is Wood. I'm from Jersey. And I would like to be informed as to the Muslim kingdom. There's two kingdoms. There's two kingdoms. There's like Saudi Arabia on the side, and then you got like Morocco in the north. And what I want to ask is that what does the king of Morocco think about like the Kurds, or like what is the northern
Of Morocco, did you say?
Yes, sir.
I don't know. The Arab Spring that radiated out from initially Tunisia left Morocco untouched. I think Morocco was fairly stable. So I don't know. I haven't seen any connection with the Kurds. Yes, sir.
Dr. Moore, back when the United States was having its little fracas in Iraq back in the 20-aughts,
Yeah.
the only thing I could glean from the media about what it was all about, there was these three factions, the Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam and the Kurds.
Yeah.
And they all seemed to be at war with the other two. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of the Kurds. I'd never heard of them before.
Right.
That shows you how dumb I am. But I just wondered, what is the religious persuasion of the Kurds? Are they Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, their own independent version of Muslim, or are most of them non-Muslim?
Majority are Sunni. There are Sunni Muslims. There are Christians, Jewish Muslim Kurds. There's I think it's called Yazidi sect, who are deemed by the others to be devil worshippers.
So then during that little fracas in Iraq, you would think that they would have allied themselves with the Sunni Muslims in Iraq against the Shiite Muslims.
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
not-
what happened?
No, not at all. See, it is too easy to paint many of these conflicts in terms of religious loyalties. The loyalties in this area are much more associated with tribe and history. Yeah? So the Sunni Kurds are fighting against the Sunni ISIS. They are quite, ISIS are a fairly extreme kind of Sunni belief, but they are against them. And they're fighting with the Shia militia from Iraq. Yeah, that's why it's part of why it's so complicated for us. Yes, ma'am.
So, just if the Kurds see themselves as an ethnic, language, cultural group, and within that group, other religions are welcome and not disputed. It's
Yeah.
more the whole, actually they have more of a nation state because of their cultural and language,
That's right.
and they're not letting the religion split them up.
They explicitly, in where they have declared this state, Rojava, they explicitly define religious freedom as a priority within their constitution. Okay, and so it's fascinating that aspect of it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Go
I
ahead.
seem to get a growing sense that the economic and commercial interests of the superpowers, as they be, as well as that web of geopolitical alliances that our superpowers are involved in, are having more impact on the decisions that are made as opposed to bringing everyone to the table and seeking some type of resolution to this mess over there.
Have you heard of a famous U.S. Marine Corps general, dead a long time now, General Smedley Butler? If you've never heard of him, there's a book by him which is a fabulous read, and he described let's see, he must have died in the 40s, and he fought in wars on behalf of the US all over the place, Philippines, China, everywhere, right? And the quote from him is that war is a racket. It's a fabulous quote. He was actually approached in between the first and second, it must have been, I think maybe the early 30s. He was approached by a group of senior business guys to effectively lead an insurrection within the US. They wanted him to march on the White House with a whole bunch of veterans armed. Okay, I mean, true story. Again, I was shocked to discover this. Yeah, so Smedley Butler, very interesting character, and he wouldn't. He said, "No, that's not right," and he was firmly of the view that war was a racket. The British Empire, the flag followed commerce, not the other way around. One more?
Question over there.
Yes.
What has happened to this congressional investigation of these 50?
It's underway right now. It started in December. Yeah, if you search on it on the web, you'll find out lots about it. But it is ongoing.
I think the most striking thing that Nicholas said was that 50 analysts in the intelligence community agreed on something, having worked there for 20 years. And I want to thank Nicholas. I'd like to introduce his wife, Pamela. Would you stand? She's from the Palestine world.
She's the reason I'm here.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Nicholas. That was
Thank you.
wonderful. The complexity of getting the courage together.